Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our first 2020 MSPOT presentation. General rule for the presentation, I will ask everyone who just joined to mute your mic. I'll get it by the end. And if you have questions, there'll be a question period at the end. You can either send them through the chat or just express that you have an interest in asking a question at the end, and we'll give you the time to ask your question, and students will answer. The presentation will last about 40 minutes, and we'll have a 20-minute question period at the end. Today, the presentation is on augmentative and alternative communication technology for children with motor and multiple impairments. It's a scoping review presented by the students from McGill Spot, Sarah Chapdelaine, Alisha Colantuono, Ellen Habke, sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, and Diana Nguyen. The clinical supervisor who supported the students is an OT from our youth program, Zoe Lavalle. And the faculty supervisor is Dr. Eva Kehayia. Being a scoping review, support from a librarian is always helpful. So Jill Baroff was supporting this project. So Sarah, I think it's you who's the first speaker. So I'll let you start the presentation.
So it's actually me that starts, but that's fine.
Okay.
So hi everyone, I'm Alisha, and Diana, Sarah, and Ellen are my other fellow OT colleagues that are here today with us. And as Chantal mentioned, today we'll be presenting to you our project on AAC technology and children with motor and multiple impairments. So here we have just a brief outline of what we'll be presenting in today's discussion. So before we actually get into all the details, we kind of just wanted to clarify how our project changed as a result of COVID-19. So basically the main idea stayed the same, but we did need to refine our research question, which we will show you in the coming slides. And we also did need to modify our methods because originally we had planned to do focus groups and semi-structured interviews, but we opted for a scoping review instead, as it would have been easier to do virtually.
Okay, so relating to what Alisha just said, the first step that we went through was to refine our research purpose because of the time and the resources that we had. So first off, we've decided to focus on communication deficits that are caused by motor and multiple impairments. So that means we've excluded diagnoses like autism spectrum disorder or Down syndrome. However, there's some of the papers that we kept, and some of them presented excluded diagnosis. And we've kept them only if the results were split and that we were able to know what finding pertains to what diagnosis, so that we could keep information that was relevant. The other main theme that we addressed was obviously augmentative and alternative communication. Within this paper, we've narrowed down our search to AAC devices, both low technology and high technology. So that means we've excluded things like gesturing or sign language. Examples of low technology devices are, as you can see here at the bottom, communication boards or writing, using pictures, and so on. High technology includes devices such as speech generating devices, single or personalized devices, or even AAC softwares that are combined to a specific technology. For your information, we've excluded in this presentation the list of all the AAC devices that were mentioned in the final list of papers that we used, so that you can access them later if you ever need to.
So in terms of the research question, here is actually the research question that we refine. So we came up with what are the barriers and facilitators in using AAC devices for children and youth with MMIs, their parents, and intervening clinicians.
Concerning these specific objectives, we wanted to determine what AAC devices are being used by children and youth with MMIs, and we also wanted to determine the environmental, systemic, and operational barriers and facilitators to the use of AAC device from the multiple perspectives, which included clinicians, parents or guardians, and users.
So now in terms of the methodology, we did use the ARC-C and O'Malley 5-step framework. So we'll go into a little bit more detail on our process. So the first step that we had to do was to identify the research question. And as I mentioned before, we kind of discussed how the research question was refined from what it was originally. The next step we had to do was we did need to identify relevant articles. So the way that worked was we had 4 different databases and we were each assigned to one. So the first steps was basically to familiarize ourselves with the databases and to do multiple searches. Then we did have to brainstorm a few times together as a team for different search strategies. We also benefited from Jill Boreff's expertise as the SPOT librarian to help us with our strategies. And the way we did it is we first started with Medline, and then we just adapted the search strategy to each database based on the tips that Jill had given us. So some of the search terms are related to impairments, anything with conditions, or even AAC devices. And we did choose to limit the articles to dating from 2010 onwards, and to have a population between the ages of 0 and 18 years old. So our goal here was to yield a manageable number of articles without leaving out any pertinent information.
In step 3, we have established our inclusion and exclusion criteria based on what the clinicians from Mackay Rehabilitation Center wanted to know, and also based on their clientele. As a result, we have included articles where the communication barrier was primarily caused by a motor impairment. We have also included articles where they highlighted the use of AAC devices, either high or low tech. And we have included papers with the population from 0 to 18 years of age. Considering there was already a systematic review published in 2012 by Baxter and al., also describing barriers and facilitators to the use of AAC devices, we have decided to include articles published starting in 2010 and onwards. As Sarah, my colleague, has mentioned, we have excluded papers where the communication barrier was primarily caused by autism spectrum disorder, and also visual impairment, deafness, and being hard of hearing. We also wanted to exclude papers where no physical devices was used to augment communication, such as only signing, gesturing, or a communication aid. In step 4, we have created an extraction table on Microsoft Excel. Here we have collected information with regards to the year of publication, the country where the study was conducted, the demographics of the population, and the type of AAC used with the corresponding access method. In the same step, we have created a summary sheet in order to present an overview of all the article extracted. We have also color-coded all the articles by in the color green, yellow, or red. Green was identified as the articles that targeted or pursued objectives. Yellow was identified as articles that could support the main concept from the green articles. And red was identified as being irrelevant to our objectives. Lastly, in step 5, we have conducted an analytical framework, which was entailed of 2 phases. The first phase, we had to classify the key characteristics of the green articles, which included year of publication, where the country, where the research was conducted, the research design, the type of data used, the type of participants, and etc. In the second phase, we have conducted a thematic analysis in order to depict the emerging ideas on a mind map. We have used 2 softwares, which was MindMeister and XMind software to do so. Here you can see on the left-hand side, this is how we have classified our articles on Microsoft Excel. On the right-hand side, it is the preliminary mind map, which is a bit disordered, but this was our first step into extracting all the themes for the articles.
So on here, you can see a flowchart that represents the process that we went through to identify and screen the articles for eligibility. So the first step that we did was to retrieve the articles within the 4 databases. And that for this, we ended up with 521 papers. Then we went through the process of removing duplicates, and we screen the remaining papers by the title and the abstract. Next, we screen the articles looking for the full text. We've actually used the same criteria and categorized them into the color scheme that Diana just mentioned, that I'll be showing you right after. Just a little highlight of the exclusion criteria, sorry, that we used. So these were gray literature, the wrong age, no AAC device use, if the impact on communication was not primarily motor, if it was the wrong diagnosis, the wrong methodology, the wrong outcome, if the paper was speech pathology focused, or if it was outside the scope of our study, or finally, if it was the language was not either English or French. On the second step, where we further excluded other papers, the only criteria that we added was no article found, which kind of speaks for itself. That's how we ended up with 37 green articles that you can see on here. So that represents, the whole diagram represents the second step of our inclusion and exclusion.
With all the articles retrieved, we have found that most of the authors have conducted their research in North America, followed by in Europe. Most of the countries in Europe were included were Sweden, Norway, United Kingdom, and Scotland. We also had a fair amount of papers where the authors have conducted their research in South America, Southeast Asia, South Africa, Australia, and other authors who conducted their research in multiple countries. Most of the papers we have retrieved were published in 2010 and 2014. We also had a fair percentage with publications in 2012, 2015, and 2020. As you can see on the bar graph, we had a constant publications from 2010 to 2020. In terms of the study design, most of the authors have used a qualitative design. You can see here in the gray bubbles, the more specific designs the authors have employed. We also had a fair amount of papers where the authors have conducted a quantitative design, and with a smaller minority with the authors conducted a mixed method, which included both qualitative and quantitative design. Most of the authors have used a mixed qualitative methods, which included interviews, video recordings, standardized assessments, focus groups. We also had a lot of papers where the authors only conducted interviews. And we also had a fair amount of papers where authors conducted utilized only quantitative methods. And for instance, this was highlighted as time rates for symbol selections by children on the actual device. In terms of the study environment, most of the research we have found, the authors have conducted in multiple settings, which included the school, the participant's home, the rehabilitation center, and the laboratory. We also had a fair percentage of articles where the authors only conducted their research at school. For the population, it varied from children with their parents, children and young adults, clinicians, parents, children with their peers, and so on. We also had most of our articles with the population aging from 0 to 18 years old. And we had a small percentage of older youth. The reason why is because we have included both articles that had children and young adults. And also why we have included it, it's because the results pertaining to the children provided novel perspective to our objectives. In terms of diagnosis, most of the population had only a motor impairment. These included cerebral palsy, spastic quadriplegia, spinal muscular dystrophy, spinal muscular atrophy type 1 and 2, rare muscle fibromyopathy, and prolonged ventilator dependence due to failure to extubate. We also had a population having motor and multiple impairments, and these included Rett syndrome, mitochondrial disorder, traumatic brain injury, leukodystrophy, developmental apraxia of speech, and cerebral palsy with other developmental or intellectual comorbidities. In the articles retrieved, most of the authors have identified as English as the language spoken. However, we have a significant amount of articles where the authors did not explicitly specify the language. Regarding the type of AAC use, most of the population use high technology AAC devices, followed by a combination of both high and low AAC devices. We had a minority who only used low technology AAC devices. The type that was used was previously mentioned by my colleague Sarah in a previous slide. So if you're ever interested, you can go back to that slide. In terms of the access, it was a fair distribution between direct, indirect, and a mix of both. The type of access was highlighted as using switches, joysticks, eye gaze, head laser, autonomic responses, or via a proxy to assist the use of AAC devices. But again, you can see here we had a lot of articles that did not specifically identify the type of access.
So I am going to go ahead and talk about how we analyzed our themes with you guys today. So don't worry, we won't go through this chart, but we just wanted to illustrate how we analyze the findings because we have all been working from distance. We did have to get a bit creative for analysis, so we as mentioned briefly previously, we put all of the barriers and facilitators that we had extracted from the literature onto one collaborative mind map. And then working together, we started to group them by similarity and pull out different themes that we saw emerging, refining, regrouping, and synthesizing these themes as we went, and really did sort of develop them iteratively, adding more results throughout the process until we had our final 6 themes that you can see here. These are accessibility, child device environment fit, family and peer engagement, service delivery, training and follow-up, and ableism and stigma. So I'll go through each one of these 6 themes and highlight some of the more salient findings. The references for all of these will be included in our final paper that we will make sure gets to all of you. So for accessibility, there were findings relating to access methods, accessibility across environments, financial accessibility. As I'm sure many of you know, finding an independent access method for children with motor and multiple disabilities can be quite a challenge, and this was reflected within the literature. However, we did find some novel methods being developed, such as using patterns of autonomic responses or using patterns of hyperkinetic movements. For autonomic responses, these researchers used patterns of skin conductance and heart rate deceleration to identify choice errors for 3 children with spastic quadriplegic CP who used single switch scanning accessed with humming. This meant that they could see where the child intended to select something but did not, or if they had selected something by accident. For hyperkinetic movement, researchers used accelerometers that they put on the upper extremities of 2 children with dyskinetic CP, and they found that they could detect specific patterns of movement for each child that did have communicative meaning. In this case, they used like or dislike for different options. While both studies did present potential avenues for developing independent access methods in the future, notably in the study on the hyperkinetic movement, they also found that once these patterns have been discerned through this analysis and with these accelerometers, clinicians could be quite quickly taught to identify those, which opens up avenues for easily teaching more communication partners to do so, which can widen a child's social circle, give them more independence, and lessen the need for parents to always be interpreting for their child. Moving on to the child device environment fit. We found that barriers and facilitators relating to the child's skills, attitudes, challenges, device characteristics, as well as environmental factors and multimodal communication. Under device characteristics, parents identified a barrier as being a lack of high quality, robust, flexible, and financially accessible mounting options. And really, they just wanted better options available to them. They felt quite limited. Some parents noted that the eye gaze axis detached really easily, that the really sort of inflexible mounting options meant that their child could only use their device in really specific contexts. For example, in their wheelchair, if that was where it was mounted. And some parents even abandoned the device altogether because they couldn't figure out how to mount it effectively. there were several features that were noted as facilitators, such as having an adjustable keyboard, having adjustable screen size, and message banking before procedures such as tracheostomies, where children will lose their voice, as well as some novel methods for customizing devices to improve user efficiency. One paper identified that children with CP had a preference for eye gaze fixation on specific areas of a screen. They identified these as being the center and the right side of the screen, and found that when they organized screen elements based on those preferences, users could select them more efficiently. They then developed a system that did this and also adapted the position of choices based on how frequently and recently they had been used. Another group of researchers developed an AAC system where when a child selected a symbol, the device would then predict likely choices for the next symbol based on the settings of the device, as well as the history of how that particular user had used each symbol, and then would suggest those predictions to the user. The results on that specific study were a bit mixed, but did show potential, and this concept of using predictive text for AAC was seen in other literature as well. For high versus low tech, one study compared the efficacy of a low tech communication board with an iPad using Go Talk Now for children with severe motor speech disorders, and while they found no significant difference in efficacy within this specific environment that they used it, they did find a clear preference for high-tech devices from users, parents, and clinicians, and did note that this preference conferred other benefits for implementation. Other studies found that speech-generating devices with eye gaze access was a facilitator, as it increased users' independent self-expression, their ability to get other people's attention, it increased their sense of self-control and capacity to engage in social interactions, and also within a hospital setting allowed them to be more involved in their own care. Barriers to eye gaze speech generating devices were that the vocabulary was not always updated, which could be kind of motivating for kids, and that they could be difficult to hear over ambient noise in public or were difficult to use in bright sunlight. Under design, there were many identified barriers and facilitators for the physical design of the device. Families identified that these facilitators were devices that were durable, user-friendly, worked effectively and consistently. However, as I'm sure many of you have experienced, a lot spoke about fragile, bulky, and flexible, and notably very heavy devices. The weight of these devices was noted as a barrier to users bringing the device around with them to different places, which can limit their use within between home and school, and also within those environments as well. This brings us to portability, where devices that were highly portable was found as to be a facilitator, as it allowed users to access the device in a wider variety of settings and gave them more consistent access to communication. Barriers to this portability were devices where the user needed to set it up to use it, but couldn't do this independently, like if it was stored in their backpack during transportation and it was quite heavy, or if a user couldn't access their device without being in specialized seating, so they couldn't use it, for example, if they were at home playing on the floor with their siblings or lying in bed. Using multimodal approach to communication by providing a variety of high and low tech AAC options, as well as different general communication strategies, was mentioned a lot of times throughout the literature, as it facilitates communication access and development by broadening a child's opportunities to communicate and also to compensate when a device isn't immediately available. For example, if a high-tech device is being sent away for repairs. Under the family and peer engagement, we found a lot of research about the difficulty that AAC users have with making social connections and the social isolation that they can really experience and feel. One very interesting paper used an intervention with one family where they videotaped interactions between a child and different familiar people, like her mother or her friend. And then they analyzed these videos for these micro moments of connection between the two people. It might have been eye gaze or specific moments of communication in different capacities. And then they shared these videos with the participants between the sessions. By the end of 4 of these sessions, they found not only more and longer eye gaze connections between the child and her mother, but they also found that the child was actually using her high-tech AAC device more. I believe it was a Dynavox. The family found that focusing on moments of successful communication, of attunement to each other, and the more relational aspects of communication, they found it to be more beneficial than some of the traditional biomedical interventions that they had tried, which really focused more on remediating those speech impairments. They found that subjectively to improve their communication within the family, but this was also echoed in the objective data that showed a clear increase in AAC device use. We also found several methods of facilitating social communication, such as one paper which gave AAC users with physical disabilities the role of knowledge provider in a game where they built models and dyads. So the AAC user would instruct their partner on how to build the model while the other person did the physical instruction. Other papers looked at using a robot controlled by AAC users to facilitate that sort of independent and symmetrical play between participants that can be really difficult with this population. Another one yet looked at how adolescent AAC users, how they felt about social media, how they use social media, and they found that it really did facilitate social interactions and improved these adolescents' sense of self-determination and of self-representation. However, they did find that users didn't always have an independent access method for a computer for social media in different settings, suggesting that improving access to social media across different settings could help facilitate the social engagement piece for these adolescents using AAC. As for parents, it was noted that a very key facilitator to AAC device use is having the parents involved and engaged. And of course, it's very difficult to implement an AAC device with a child without the parents buying into the process. Some barriers to this included parents who could understand their child's more idiosyncratic communication methods. And so they didn't really see a need for an AAC device. Unfortunately, as I'm sure many of you have seen and can understand, this serves as a barrier to developing language skills and independent communication, to widening their social circle, and it really does place a heavy burden on parents to always have to be interpreting for their child. Other parents expressed fears that using an AAC device would actually prevent their child from developing normative verbal communication. Related to this high demand on parents to facilitate communication, to always be advocating, caring for their child, coordinating care, was noted in the literature, and it was noted that parents really do need more support with a lot of this. I have both informal and formal support from other parents, resource sharing, connections with parents, whether online or in person, was noted, as well as more support from clinicians in different capacities. For service delivery, we found that barriers and facilitators were related to holistic care, interdisciplinary care, and also delays in accessing services. Holistic care really does encompass a lot of what we're talking about today, and just means taking a broader approach to care, considering all aspects of the child's physical and social environments, including the ethnocultural, social, socioeconomic, linguistic factors of their environment, to really help find and implement a device that can fit best within a child's day-to-day life and within their family, their community, and their school. Involving the family in this process was seen many times as a facilitator, including involving the family in all phases of the assessment, implementation, generalization, follow-up, because they will be the ones really helping to implement and generalize this, as well as their buy-in into the process really does help. And they know their kids very well, so they're able to provide really good input. For example, one paper found that families had a really good in-depth understanding of their child's routine, vocabulary, and existing communication that clinicians could use to maximize the functionality of a device within a child's home and community. For interdisciplinary care, it was noted that there's not only a need for collaboration between clinicians, but also between the clinical team and the educational team at schools. As for delays in accessing services, it was noted, as I'm sure all of you know, that a shortage of providers means that there are often long waits to be assessed for AAC and delays in receiving this device, which serves as a barrier not only to communication in the interim, but also long-term as children lack access to communication during those really critical ages for language development. For training and follow-up, we found barriers and facilitators to each of these areas on here. It was noted repeatedly that there's just a need for more training and follow-up for everybody involved, including members of the educational team, the clinical team, parents, communication partners, and even users themselves. For clinicians, it was found that many clinicians didn't feel confident or capable in using an AAC device, which served as a barrier to care and device use in a lot of different ways. For example, within hospital settings where nursing staff reported being almost entirely reliant on parents to communicate with children and really not being able to use an AAC device to communicate with these children directly. For parents and communication partners, it was noted that sometimes prescribing clinicians sometimes assume that communication partners know how to communicate with the user or that they know how to use an AAC device, and that many parents and educators assume that a child would be more independent in using the device than they actually were. A lack of training and follow-up from clinicians was noted as contributing to some device misuse, which left users and families frustrated, seeing little improvement, and sometimes leading to abandonment of the device altogether. The consultative model was noted as contributing to this lack of training and follow-up, as clinicians were less available to scaffold training, to problem solve and make adjustments as the user becomes more familiar with the device. But as I mentioned before, delays in accessing services was also noted as a barrier. And unfortunately, we did not find any magical cures for the age-old problem of balancing wait lists and continuity of care. Finally, a lack of funding for professionals and resources was noted as a barrier, as was the time constraints that this lack of funding does place on professionals who often don't have the time required to engage in meaningful ways with this population. For our last theme, ableism and stigma, we found that the stigma of using an AAC device, as well as the view of AAC as an illegitimate method of communication, served as a barrier in a lot of ways. This included negative reactions from peers or from members of the public, as well as a desire for normative communication that really discounts methods other than verbal speech as being a valid mode of communication. And even we found reports of educators turning AAC devices off in the classroom because they saw them as being disruptive, indicating a real misunderstanding that AAC devices are an important connection between a child and the world around them.
So all these findings that Ellen just described extensively, so we've decided to analyze them based on Bronfenbrenner's ecological model of child development. So this model stipulates that the child is in constant and dynamic interaction with the other layers, and this ultimately has an impact on their development. Here's what the model looks like in case you've never seen it or if it's like far back in your memory. So the middle here represents the individual, and in this we have to consider the biopsychosocial characteristics of the child. The second layer represents the microsystem, and within this system we have to consider the biopsychosocial characteristics of the groups that interact directly with the child. So within this system, we include like parents, clinicians, peers, teachers, and so on. The third layer is the mesosystem, and within this system, this actually includes the interactions between the groups in the micro level. So as an example, if there was a clinician that would offer a training to the parents, this action wouldn't really affect directly the child, but it still would have an impact on him or her. So that would be something to consider within the mesosystem. The last layer that we focused on was the macro system that includes the overarching structures regulating the systems. For example, ableism in our society would be a factor part of the macro system because it might impact the child that's using AAC devices. On a side note, this model originally contains two more layers, which are the exosystem that you see on white on the screen, as well as the chronosystem. However, we've decided to exclude them as the findings that we had, we didn't think that was relevant to combine them with the findings. With regard to the interpretation, when we analyze our finding using Bronfenbrenner's model as a framework, we found that the micro-level components targeted the educators, teachers, clinicians, communication partners, parents and family, peers, and the AAC device itself. At the macro level, we identified the relevant components as being funding and insurance, cultural and social factors, laws, policies, and guidelines, and finally, training. When our 6 themes are applied to this model, we really see that the successful use of an AAC device depends on the complex interplay between all the levels and the components of this model. If we take a closer look, at the individual level, the child device and environment fit really applies in the context of considering the cognitive, physical, and social capacities of the child, as well as the age and motivation of every client. At the level of the microsystem, the characteristics of each group that interacts with the child must be taken into account in combination with the access methods, the social communication, family involvement and beliefs, and clinicians' selection and implementation of the device. The meso level is related to a holistic, strength-based, and interdisciplinary approach to care. This one pertains to clinicians' training, following up with, and supporting each micro-level group. An example of this would be the clinicians addressing parents' fears and expectation for the AAC device use to increase successfulness. With regard to the macro system, all of our identified themes impact the macro level group, whether through stigma and social factors or service delivery and funding.
So now we wanted to share some of the perspectives that we found around the world concerning this topic, just to have a little glimpse of what's going on outside of North America and to get more of a holistic worldview. So we'll go over a few of them together. So if we start with Sri Lanka, ableism does seem to be one of the apparent barriers to the use of AAC devices. If we look in Hong Kong, there was actually an interesting study where 72% of respondents mentioned that they were not satisfied with the training that they received, which is quite alarming because it's more than half of them. Similarly, in Taiwan, only 12% of respondents in the study said that they had high levels of knowledge for high and low tech communication devices. And again, a similar trend in South Africa, but here with OTs, PTs, and teachers, they described that they did not receive any training on AAC in university. So these are just different international perspectives that have very similar themes to those that we found within North America in terms of ableism and training, which is eye-opening because these issues are not limited to just us, but rather are seen across the globe, which implies that there's a lot of education around this topic that is still needed. So now in terms of limitations, we will go over a few. So time limitation was one of the main ones for us because of COVID-19 and with respect to our scoping review. We also only explored 4 databases for articles that were written in French and English since we were only 4 students. And also the fact that all our meetings were held virtually, it demanded us to adapt very quickly, which might have explained the disconnect and difficulties that we did have trying to put together the analysis for all our themes. So in terms of future research, our conducting the study did bring about some topics that we wanted to further explore in the future, or anybody else who wants to take the lead for the next future projects. And if we actually take a look of what's on the screen, it might look familiar to a few of you because it is the original research question that we had, but we didn't have a chance to fully explore it. So basically the next steps in continuation of our project would be to explore the optimal use for AAC in adults, the optimal time for the introduction of AAC devices within the developmental phase, and the optimal length of training that is needed. So essentially these would just be great avenues to further explore and could actually maybe be another research project for the next master's cohort students. So to conclude, as our presentation comes to an end, we did just want to tie everything all back to this image that you see. And as we can see, it does resemble the Bronfenbrenner model with the themes that we came up with and the arrows that represent the dynamic interaction between the themes within the model. So the purpose here was just to get a really big picture in terms of the situation that families, you clinicians, and users live on a daily basis when using AAC devices. And that essentially everything of every component of each system does have some sort of effect on the other. But by working together, this is where I'm sure most clinicians do see the most positive experiences for the individual when using AAC devices. So thank you so much for listening to our presentation during, I'm sure it's your lunch hour, so thank you so much, we really appreciate it. But we also did want to thank Jill Bora for her assistance with refining our search strategies, Zoe Lavalle for her work as the clinical supervisor of the project, Chantal Robillard as the coordinatrice de recherche at Mackay, and of course, Dr. Eva Kehayia for her support and her guidance throughout the entire process. So thank you very much. And now I guess we'll open it up to questions that everyone may have.
Thank you, students, for your presentation. It was clear and detailed. So for questions, you can either say, I have a question, or write it up in the chat box. Or if you want, is also when you click on the participants, you can raise your hand on the right, at the bottom right side of your screen. Vanessa, you're going to manage the questions?
Oui, allô. Je regarde s'il n'y a pas de questions.
Yes.
Ah.
Go ahead, Paul.
Hi, do you guys hear me?
Yes, we do.
Oh, fantastic. First of all, I want to congratulate the students for a great presentation. My question is, I know that they said that for future studies, perhaps, one of the questions should be looking at when to introduce this training throughout the developmental of the children. However, I wanted to know if throughout their readings and their findings, if they did come or see a common pattern of what age they would introduce the AACs, and what do they think? What would be the best time, even though they don't have the answer just yet? Did they see anything that can maybe lead us into a good time to introduce this?
I think that the key message for, sorry, it's like, yeah, there's a bit of lag. So I think that the key message for answering this question would be the earlier, the better.
Okay.
That's what we've read throughout most of the papers. So it's hard to answer specifically that question because there wasn't, like, studies were mostly involving a lot of participants. So they wouldn't address this topic specifically, but more give like general messages.
I think it's also important to highlight if they're introducing it later, most of the family have already developed a communication strategy. So they might become more reluctant in introducing the use of AAC devices. So it's really multiple factors that we have to take into consideration. But what Sarah has said is the earlier, the better, as the main consensus of most of the articles.
Mm-hmm.
There was also one, oh, sorry, I was going to say there was also one article that spoke quite specifically to tracheostomies. And one of the things that they noted was often clinicians were not, because the majority of them were happening under the age of 1, that clinicians weren't referring to SLP for pre-linguistic skill assessment, but that SLPs had noted that would be useful and valuable, and that people just weren't aware that they figured that was too young. So that was the one thing that we found that gave specific ages.
Thank you so much. I think I really appreciate it.
Okay, so there's another question from Zoe.
Hi, I wanted to start by saying that you girls did an amazing job. I know it wasn't easy. We had a big project and then we had to change everything. So thank you very much for all you've done and all the hard work. And I'm sorry I hadn't been as available in the last couple of weeks, but I think it's amazing what you did. I was wondering, you were mentioning that in some of the research that you read, there were quite a few parents that were dissatisfied with the amount of training that they received. So I was wondering, is there any, was there any suggestion as per the type of training that they would have rather have, or how long, or was there about following up on a regular basis? Was there any indication on how we can do better to provide training for the families and educators?
Yeah, I think a lot of the really big theme was that because I think a lot of parents found that the model of prescribing clinicians, consulting, assessing, giving a device, and then moving on wasn't working very well for them, and they really wanted more consistent follow-up to sort of help them, because getting all of the information at once of how to use the device forever was too overwhelming. They weren't retaining it, the child wasn't retaining it, and so having more consistent follow-up to help sort of sculpt those skills over time as the child develops more competencies, and to help navigate maybe some of the challenges that come up along the way that might, without follow-up from clinicians, lead to them just not being addressed, and to the device really sort of being poorly used or suboptimally used over time. Was a big one. I think that was a big piece of it, as well as connecting with different people within the child's life, like the educators at school, and making sure that they also knew how to use the device, the expectations, how similarly to sculpt those skills with the child, and then having similar follow-up just to make sure that those problems were being solved. I think the real theme was that getting all of the information at once, and then not getting more follow-up and information later didn't seem to be very helpful, because it didn't allow for changes and was quite overwhelming. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
So is there any other questions? No.
Okay. So what will be the one take-home message from your research? I know that's tough. So in one sentence, what should clinicians retain from your presentation?
Go ahead, Sarah.
Well, I was just gonna say, maybe not one sentence, but what image that we've created, what Ellen did. I'm just gonna go back. There. Okay. So I think for me that really illustrates the interplay between all the actors and all the components that that must be taken into account. And I think the take-home message would really be about considering them all together and not as separate actors throughout the process.
Thank you, Sarah.
One of the papers said quite succinctly that it's not enough for a child to have the operational skills, like the literacy, the ability to access the device. That's not enough. For it to really be successful, there's a lot more broad considerations that need to be taken into account as well.
Great. Well, thank you all. As a reminder, MSPOT projects are research projects conducted by master's students. And in this case, it was a question that was raised by Zoe, one of our clinicians, and we had the support from students and Eva to answer that question. So I encourage all clinicians attending right now to submit your questions for next year, so we can have a group of students providing you with great answers. I don't know if there's anything else, students, you want to say. Eva, if you want.
Yeah, actually, I'd like to congratulate the students. They worked really hard. I can attest to that. until the very last minute. And Zoe, thank you very much for your support and responding to messages, emails, even when you were working more frontline. And Chantal, thank you for being there with us. So really appreciate it. We all learned a lot. I certainly did.
Great. Well, thank you all for attending, and we have a presentation tomorrow and Wednesday as well at noon. So join us for more student project, MSPOT project. Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye.